Hi, welcome to the premiere season of Funeral Disruptors. I'm your host, Felicia Barlow, an award-winning event and video producer, author, and writer. I believe each of us has a purpose, and the privilege of our lifetime is being exactly who we are. I believe in deep spiritual philosophies that every being matters, and one goal I have is to change the conversation from grief to gratitude. When my beloved stepfather and sister died a few years ago, I was tasked with working with funeral home templates that did not express who they were. Being an event producer, I was able to personalize the templates, but I delved deeper to see what else was available to tell our loved ones' stories, and I found many alternatives and options that funeral homes often do not share. I decided to do this podcast to share the many resources out there that few consumers know exist. Today, my guest is my sister, full transparency, who is a former funeral director. She had worked in the funeral industry since 1999, first as an apprentice during her completion of her associate's degree in mortuary science at the University of the District of Columbia. She was a licensed funeral director mortician in the state of Maryland and Virginia, and she was a registered crematory operator in Maryland with 7 years managing a crematory. She received her licensure for life insurance in Maryland in order to write pre-need funeral contracts, and she has an experience as a cemetery sales counselor in Maryland. So you can absolutely see why I wanted her to be a guest on my show. One of the things when I decided to delve into doing celebrations of life, I talked to her about working with funeral homes and seeing, if they would be open to working with me as an event producer. And she gave me a lot of information about funeral homes, which I didn't know. And that is where I want to start with you, Kaija. This is my sister, Kaija Barlow Dallessandro. It's not a usual career path I would say I don't think many women, first of all, choose to do that. So I wanted to know what inspired you to become a funeral director.
That's a great question. I kind of had this thought in my head without directly looking at it for my entire life growing up, that you were born into the funeral directing business. Just that there are people who do that and you don't do it unless you were born into it. And at one point I thought, well, wait, could you just become a funeral director? And then I had a friend and former coworker who came back after that I hadn't seen for a couple of years. I said, what are you doing now? She said, well, I'm a funeral director. I said, you can just go into it. And I was piqued. My curiosity was piqued. I was pre-med to go to medical school for psychiatry. That was something that I wanted to do following my bachelor's degree. And I realized I shouldn't go to med school because people who say ow make me pass out. So somebody who's already deceased does not make me pass out, but I can still use the same anatomical interests. So that it just kind of happened, and I started an internship, and it's thought, well, we'll find out if I can do it or not, and I just loved it.
I think that's interesting right there to start there is a lot of people don't want to talk about death and dead bodies because they think it's squeamish and everything. I look at it like just the opposite of end. Like it's such a sacred moment that you're assisting somebody out of their lifetime. I mean, is there any myths around dead bodies that you can dispel?
There are all the horror movie tropes and the things that you hear from friends growing up that dead bodies sit up or dead bodies make noise, and no, dead bodies don't do much of any of those things. Maybe shortly after someone passes, when you're moving the deceased around, there can be like air trapped, someplace, and you've just disrupted the gravity of the body, and the air escapes. But just the ways in which we were brought up or taught to fear dead bodies is very interesting.
Yeah, I would imagine that, working with dead bodies, and especially in a crematorium, has to change you in some way. Do you think that it did that in any way?
I don't feel like anything changed for me. I feel that it was a really great place for me to be because I had this impression of the job that it needs to be something that a perfectionist takes on because, like you were saying, it's sacred and holy. I want to make sure that the person handling these things is doing everything 100% all the way, not cutting any corners, not ignoring any of the wishes of the family, not doing doing everything that they can in order to honor this person. And I've always felt like that, and I always have done that. And then the idea that somebody might not is what irks me. So I think just from the length of time I spent in my positions in the funeral industry, I would just get more and more wary of what others were doing. I would think, well, if it takes me this long to do this and you can do that in half the time, what are you not doing? So
I've seen a lot of those. Yeah, I've seen a lot of those stories in the past few years, coming up about the people that, maybe cremated somebody and didn't do anything with them, left them in the funeral home. Or do you think that's more of a rarity than, the norm? Or do you think cutting corners and this, like, I believe you can explain this further, how there's really only a few corporations that own most of the funeral homes. So do you find that the corporations are what is cutting the corners?
I don't. I think it's the opposite, funny enough. I think that Maryland is a very interesting example. There's
I think you're cutting in and out.
a certain number. Can you hear me?
Hey.
There you are. So in Maryland, there's only a certain number of corporate licenses for funeral homes to be owned by a corporation and a corporate entity. And so you kind of see the opposite in Maryland that you do in some other states, such as Virginia, where in Virginia, you have to search around to find a mom and pop or local owned business, as opposed to Maryland, where the majority of places that you're going to find are going to be independent funeral homes. And I think that gives Maryland a very interesting problem in that the private companies think that they can rule the roost, that they can be the big fish in the pond, and it's not the case in any other state. And I think that it's those independent people in Maryland that I saw really cutting some of the corners.
That's interesting.
Money.
It's sad too. Now, I know one of the things that you shared with me when I first, decided that I wanted to do celebrations of life was that in Maryland, consumers don't have to go to a funeral home, that there was only a limited number of requirements that you have to go to a funeral home for. Can you explain further about that? And if you know more about other states as well.
Yes, I can. I'm sorry, can you repeat that part?
If you can explain it, like from Virginia as well, because I've done a lot of research on it, and I've discovered that you only need a funeral director, I believe, in 9 states.
That would be correct. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but indeed it does vary state to state, which is one of the very tricky things about having a conversation about the death industry. The Maryland Consumer Death Council, I can't remember exactly what their title of their company is called. There's headquartered in Montgomery County is a Maryland consumers group that tries to put out information for people about their funeral choices. I don't know if Virginia has a similar thing, but it comes down to the fact that if a person passes away and is taken to or was in a hospital, there are some hospitals which automatically release to funeral homes, to licensed funeral directors at funeral homes, according to their regulations and policies. And I don't know that all the hospitals have a way for families to take their deceased loved one out of the morgue at the hospital. So that kind of that's the first step in overcoming this licensed hurdle in order to be able to do your own funerals. There's got to be a way to do it, but you might have some trouble depending on the hospitals. And then the death certificate is the other really large thing for a funeral home to be involved in, because most people in our area would not know all of the parts of a death certificate that need to be completed and how they should be completed. And now that they're electronic, I don't even know that the access to the same tools is available to the public as would be available to funeral directors. That being said, I could get a death certificate, complete all of the non-physician parts of the death certificate, go to my deceased relative's physician, have them fill out the physician part of it, the medical information, presuming it's a natural death, and then I can file that myself with the state vital records. As long as I am taking the person to a place where they are able to be interred, then you don't need a funeral director to take care of who's passed away. In order to take care of someone who's passed away in a manner and fashion that we are accustomed to, you're absolutely going to need a funeral director.
And what was that? You cut up a little bit. The manner they're accustomed to, is that what you said? Taking, yeah. At the very end there, you kind of went in and out, and you were saying that something about the funeral home, I guess, in the manner we become accustomed to. I'm filling in the blanks.
Right. So, sure. What you do not need a funeral director in order to take care of a deceased loved one, but you do need a funeral director in order to have funeral arrangements and services in the way that we've all become accustomed to. The things that take place that we are seeing as normal mourning rituals and rites of grief absolutely do require a funeral director. And that's something that people are going to have to shift their expectations and their hopes and wishes, and they can do it by themselves if they do those things.
That kind of brings me to home funerals. Do you have any thoughts about that? I wouldn't say that's a big.
Love it.
Okay, I wouldn't say that's a big surging thing, but I do know it is something that is out there.
I love. When I was a funeral director, I just always wanted to do home funerals, and we never had any. When I was in mortuary science school, I had class with another student whose family had owned this funeral home for many years, and they had begun doing home funerals and putting cooling trays underneath a bed in the living room so that the body could be out for, guests to call. All of that just fascinated me, and I always liked to think that if we had a family funeral, that I'd be able to have the casket in the house of whichever family member it was that passed away. I just kind of like the idea of everybody being able to come and visit and spending time with the person without having it feel unnatural or formal.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And you could even explain that also about embalming, that embalming is not necessary.
Right. And every price list should tell you in the state that you're in if it is required and if it is, under what circumstances it's required. But in most cases, a deceased family member does not need to be embalmed. However, if you are going to have a viewing or time spent with the person after they've passed, it would be highly suggested. People say, oh, embalming's a scam, it's a way to get money, it's bad for us, why do the funeral homes make you do it? And then you have a family that approaches an amenable funeral director and says, we don't want this body embalmed. And the funeral director goes, okay. And you have a funeral. Every single person comes up to the staff of the funeral home going, what's wrong with them? They do not look good. You guys did not do a good job. Well, the family requested that the deceased not be embalmed, and that's what they look like when they're not embalmed. So they didn't look natural and at rest. They looked like they were dead. And that's just something that we don't expect to see at a funeral, is a dead body. We expect to see somebody in repose comfortably and sanitized. So we have to get our minds around this idea of clean death.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know where that even came about? I mean, to me, it's just so weird that we do live in this society that doesn't think death is normal. And so it's like we try to avoid it in every way. And I would say that's a good example.
Yeah, it's a very American thing to not embrace death. We have done everything we can to, selfishly isolate ourselves away from that unpleasantness.
Can you like in history? Because I know that embalming became a big thing during the Civil War because of the transport of bodies.
Correct.
So in history that points to why we have this weird relationship?
I think that it's I think it's hard to pinpoint in history because not everyone has this view that the American way of death is wrong. And so history is written by the winners, right? So I can't say where those in America decided collectively, we're just going to try to step over our grief, get over our grief, rather than live with and go through our grief, and hold those who are dear with us even when they're gone. I don't know when that happened. I think I would suspect that, given the size of the United States, that moving around and being distances, as we saw in the Civil War, which is why they began embalming, so that people could come back home to their loved ones after they had passed. I think people just kept spreading out and moving farther and farther from their community areas, and were separate from it. I don't know.
I thought maybe something like in the rise of medical care or something may have medicalized it more and made it more transactional, because it used to be handled by families. Death used to be handled by families, which is where the living room came in. They used, like you said, they used to lay people out in the parlor, and that's actually how the term living room came about, was when they did away with that. I think it was Ladies'
And-
Home Journal coined it.
And funeral parlor, because it was the parlor.
Ah,
So the United States is very interesting because we pay for our health care individually and independently, and we have a very capitalized healthcare system, elder care system, and it's very difficult to make money on goodwill. The goodwill of people taking care of their dead family in their home, that doesn't make anybody any money. So why would you do it that way? So you need to insert some sort of regulations in the state to get the state some money every time that somebody dies. And then you can create more jobs by creating an industry involved with all of that, which isn't necessary, but everybody's going to use. And then those people have jobs. It creates more taxes for the state so that the state can take care of people. Say, wait a minute, we were taking care of our family just fine, and everything got disrupted because you wanted to make money. So
that's interesting. And you had mentioned this to me years ago. It's the Funeral Consumers Alliance, and
that's what it is. Yes.
It's a national organization. I think there's a chapter in almost every state. In fact, one I guessed in this series is going to be the executive director of the overall Funeral Consumers Alliance.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. So would you say that they are a part of trying to break up? I mean, it almost seems like a monopoly in some ways.
I think that they are very proudly giving people back their choices. People don't realize that they have choices, and the more they can get attention at the Consumers Alliance, the more educated people we will have. And there's still always going to be people who are uncomfortable with the conversation at all and are just going to do everything the way everything's normally done. And why would you upset the apple cart and go to the Consumer Alliance and figure out how to do things on your own? I'll just pay somebody to do it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I want to dispel the myth that you have to immediately call a funeral home the minute somebody passes away. I mean, yes, it's convenient, but there are other ways to do it. I mean, especially if it's not affordable for some people. If some people can't afford, what some funeral homes charge,
Indeed. Now, let's say somebody is at home and their loved one passes away at home. Unless they are there under hospice care with the physician having a representative at the home, and the representative calls the physician to say, all right, the person has passed. Any other circumstance where somebody dies at home, you have to call 911. You have to, because the police have to come to the home, confirm that there's no foul play apparent, contact the physician for the deceased person, talk to them, say, will you sign the death certificate? The doctor says, yes, we'll sign the death certificate. And then the police are satisfied and say, okay, you can call your funeral home now. Mm-hmm. Our police are not necessarily the most widely educated populace. They are not taught every possible scenario. So I would hazard that if a death happened in my family, I called 911, the police came, they confirmed that the doctor was fine signing a death certificate. If they turned to me and said, okay, which funeral home are you calling? And I said, I'm not calling a funeral home. I guarantee you it's going to take a while. It's going to take a long time with that county or city's police force to follow through on what it is that you are trying to say and accomplish, because you're definitely disrupting their process then.
Yeah. I have heard that, and also with physicians, that a lot of physicians and hospitals have also like fought with families that want to do home funerals or something a little bit different. So
That's
but,
tragic. Why would they fight them? That's
I think because,
heartbreaking.
yeah, exactly what you're saying though. They don't know that you don't have to call, that there are other ways out there. Do you find, or do you think that more women coming into the industry will change it in any way?
I have been hearing about more and more women coming into the industry since I went to mortuary school and since I started my internship. So I don't think that in 22 years, if we haven't already taken it over, we must be on the precipice of taking it over as women, because in mortuary science school, I would say it was about half and half, females and males in our classes for studying to be a funeral director. And I would say that most apprentices that I have seen for the past 2 decades have all been female. I I find it a strange question to ask, because living in it, it feels like there's an awful lot of women. I feel like it's woman dominated, but of course it can't be.
Yeah.
We used to talk about the good old boys club, and there's definitely a good old boys club, but I don't know how effective they are in getting their alpha male ways nowadays, surrounded by all the estrogen.
Yeah, it just seems like women would bring a whole different energy to it. Just like, I mean, I don't want to say that men don't have a sanctity for life or anything, because that's just not true. But I think women, I mean, like what I was saying, it's like the birthing process, it's the death process, that women would just have a different understanding of it.
I can see that. I will say that I have worked with some extremely gifted and compassionate funeral directors that were men.
Mm.
And I think the best quality interpersonally is just to feel like you've been heard, and to feel so grateful that you want to give the funeral director a hug at the end of all of the services. That is when you know that you've made a great difference. And I have been fortunate to see so many grateful families with people that I've worked with. I had some very talented coworkers.
That's nice to hear. That's good. I know I had something else. One of the things you said is that you received your licensure for life insurance in order to write pre-need funeral contracts. Can you explain what a pre-need funeral contract involves?
You bet. You bet. Again, this is going to vary state to state. Some states allow you to have a prearranged funeral with a funeral home that is paid for in advance in different ways. And the states are going to have their legislation, regulations saying how that can be. In Virginia, you can place your prepaid funeral arrangements in a trust or in insurance. And in Maryland, you can do it with insurance. But that also means that you have to be a licensed insurance agent in the state. So you have to go through the training and the testing to get that license and be signed on with a life insurance company, because that's somehow tied in with getting your licenses. It has to be attached to a company. So whatever company your funeral home sells its pre-need insurance through, that company is going to hire you as their licensed insurance person so that you can take the test, get your license, and then fill out the extra paperwork to accept a check on behalf of the insurance company saying that your funeral is paid in full.
Wow, that's just a whole other piece of the industry. I had no idea. Like I knew that, they use the life insurance, but I didn't realize how tied together.
And it's interesting because life insurance, going the insurance route, it really does work out best, because in states or in places where they don't do it that way, you've had historic stories of embezzlement of pre-need funds, or deals where 80 years ago the funeral director took the money from the family and put it in the funeral home, and 50 years later that family passes away and the funeral director they dealt with is long dead, and I don't know what deal grandpa had with you. And it could just be all very messy. With the insurance industry, you have such stringent paperwork and tracking guidelines that it's really a comfort to a family or a funeral home to know that where the funds are, that they're done, and that you can have that money when you need it, whether it be at your original funeral home you set it up at or not.
Wow, that's interesting. Do you know anything about the tax law? I just learned about this not that long ago from an estate attorney that at least in the state of Maryland, most of the charges now, like for a celebration of life, are tax deductible. Have you heard anything about that?
I haven't. No, I really have not.
Okay. I'll have to get her on as one of my guests.
Yes, do it. I can't wait to hear that.
Yeah. I know I had another question that just came up. I mean, God, you have so much information around the whole industry. I do want to hear, do you know anything about funerals or the way that they do things in other countries?
A little bit. I'm definitely no expert, but I've stopped by cemeteries and, if possible, funeral homes when I'm traveling, and I know that that's very strange, but I went to for lack of a better word, funeral home in Helsinki, Finland, and it's a little shop front, and they don't have funeral directors. They have people that are working in the shop there that can plan the date and time for you for the cemetery, for the crematory. And I guess there are no viewings. They have if you are going to see your loved one, you're going to see them in the hospital. So I think basically their version of a parlor in the morgue where you go visit your family member. And then most decedents in Finland are cremated, and then the burial of the ashes is planned for some future date. I guess it doesn't always happen immediately because maybe the ground is frozen and they have to plan around that. And the shop was, the people working there were very nice, and they had options of urns and caskets, but it was nothing like what we do. In Italy, they have beautiful craftsmanship in there. They actually have some coffins rather than caskets in Italy. We call them toe pinchers in the business. That's that classic Dracula style coffin that you've seen in the cartoons and in the TV shows, instead of a casket, which is the rectangular piece that we're accustomed to having here in the United States. But Italy's got some beautiful coffins, and they do not embalm. I think that most other countries, you're going to find no one on staff knows how to embalm. they don't have a need for it. They don't have a system in place to teach people because they don't need to know how to do it. They're not going to have a viewing or a delay in burial like we will here. And if they do, then they have a hermetically sealed metal inside to a casket that is then sealed, and just wait until you can get it buried for whatever reason the delay was, and that's what you do. There is just not a process in place for them to require, need, or want the embalming procedure that we do here in the United States.
That's interesting. So they typically have viewings?
We had a family that came to make arrangements at one of my funeral homes once, where their family member had passed away in Italy, and there are international laws in place for how remains of a person can come into different countries. There's a whole book that we have at the funeral home that lists the requirements by country. And for a body to come back into the U.S., it needs to be embalmed. Well, embalmed is a very subjective term, apparently, because embalmed meant basically pouring embalming fluid on the outside of the body and sealing it up and sending it to us, so that when we opened it up, we thought, ooh, that is another level.
Yeah.
But our embalming process is literally sanitizing the inside and the outside of a body to stop the decomposition process as much as possible. So you can see why that would be great. And everybody doesn't agree with that.
It is, like, when you say it like that, it is kind of an odd procedure.
It is.
Yeah.
But I think if you spend a lot of time around bodies, like let's say in a war zone, and you were around a lot of bodies, you'd start to think, boy, I sure wish there was a way I could get these to stop becoming more and more unpleasant.
Yeah.
And sure, we found that way.
Yeah. That's interesting to know that it's pretty much a distinctly American thing, though. I didn't know that at all.
It really is. They've got to have, like, transport companies that work in other countries that specialize in embalming for bringing United States citizens home to be laid at rest. But it's certainly not widely available.
Well, that for some reason reminds me of, it was one of your colleagues when our sister passed away a few years ago, that I have to say, it was a blessing that she shared when her children at first thought about dividing the ashes up into 4 urns. And your colleague kind of gave a whole explanation as to why that's not a good idea. Because I hear more and more people doing that. And I don't think people think of generations ahead. I don't know if you want to speak on that, or I just.
Well, cremation in the United States is a very funny animal too, because in other countries, from what I can see, someone gets cremated and then the urn is interred, just like a casket would be. But in the United States, no, we one up that and we keep them, or we divide them up amongst family members, or we decide that we're going to go on a traveling. We're going to go on a trip where we scatter their remains in all the places that they ever loved. We overcomplicate it. But it isn't something that you can do.
Yeah.
But eventually, if the urn is not interred, then you're going to have a family member in 50 years go, what's in here? Oh, that's your great grandma.
Yeah. Like, that's one of the sad stories that I read not that long ago, or heard about, was the man, I don't remember what state he's in, but he was a funeral director that was cremating people, I guess, I don't, out of service for people maybe that couldn't afford it, but there was no families to take it. So in the bottom of his funeral home, he had all these urns. And I think they were going to fine him for it, like he was keeping them for some odd reason, but he wasn't. He was actually doing a service. But it makes me think of that. Like, what happens to it generations down the line if we don't do something with it?
Well, once you have the cremated remains in your family's possession, it's your issue. It's your problem. But for the funeral homes, I think it does come down to what the state laws allow you to do. There are definitely cremated remains from 70 years ago in the basement of every funeral home. Because that family was going to come back and they never did. And they tried to call and they tried to call. Then there was nobody to call. And then they thought, well, we better hold on to it just to be safe. And the states, I believe, have collectively decided to move forward with legislation allowing funeral homes to dispose of the cremated remains without having the liability that they're worried about. A lot of states had come to realize that they needed to have a way in place for funeral homes to dispose of long outdated cremated remains without liability to them, because bless their hearts, they had been holding on to these for years, waiting for somebody to come and retrieve them, but they needed a way to get rid of them. So there are, I know in Maryland, it was, I believe, 3 years. After 3 years, you can dispose of cremated remains that are unclaimed. The funeral home can track the paperwork saying how often they tried to contact somebody, how they were unable to contact someone with all the information they had been given, how somebody never came back to claim this, and then they can put them where they saw fit with a note in the file for the family should they return. Still, with that in place, many funeral homes are like, no, we'll just hold on to them in this closet or this basement for another 10 years to be on the safe side. But then you can maybe use a niche in a columbarium, like the mausoleum for urns. You can have a niche, place all of your unclaimed cremated remains in there, and you just have it marked that it's in memory of the many, and have that noted at the funeral home so that you can retrieve them back out. That is something that a funeral home is more likely to do than disposing of them in a community columbarium or ossuary. So there's some cemeteries that have an option available of basically you scatter the cremated remains into a group pool. Not quite sure what a great word for that is.
You mean like all together?
Yes. Oh. Yeah. So there's an underground receptacle with a bumper, kind of to make sure that everything doesn't gather in the center, and the family can pour the cremated remains into the opening in the ground, and it goes down to be intermingled with others that have done the same. And that is definitely a legal option for funeral homes that are looking to relieve their cremated remains from their locked up burden of not being picked up by families. But those are things that funeral homes can do. They can hold on to urns forever, or they can follow their state guidelines for, moving them to somewhere else. But what happens when your state doesn't have guidelines? What happens when the family has the urn now and you don't know what to do with your great-grandmother? So it's something that you should determine your comfort level in your family of discussing and come up with a plan that everyone can stick to. Sure, why don't we all hold on to the cremated remains of our loved ones for one generation, and then we're all going to bury them in this one space. with a monument to last name of family. Maybe that's an option.
Yeah. That is an idea. I mean, would that be possible to do, like, say, in a cemetery plot?
Yes, but again, that's going to be dependent on what that cemetery's regulations are. Some cemeteries have rules in place where you may only have up to 4 sets of urns in one plot. Now, you could buy several plots, but it comes down to their record keeping and their ability to mark on the grave who is there. It's all bunk, because really they could just allow you as many as you could fit in that spot. But you can't run a place without rules.
Yeah.
If you run a place without rules, it won't run. So
I see one of the things that you did was you sat on the advisory council for the Maryland State Office of Cemetery Oversight as the crematory representative. So was that one of the, like, that kind of stuff, what you dealt with is helping form regulations?
What's very interesting about the Office of Cemetery Oversight is that it is an intermediary between the state and the cemeteries. It does a lot of assistance. It does a lot of the paperwork, but it doesn't have any mechanism in place to create laws or enforce laws. They're a council, not a board. But that was a very enriching experience to work there, because the other representatives on the council were so diverse and so expert in their different fields within the cemetery industry that I learned so much from just listening to them debate a topic. The OCO, as we call them, the Office of Cemetery Oversight, the OCO would often look into and address tragic stories that you hear that hit the news, such as, in our watershed, we discovered 50 broken headstones from 100 years ago. What do you do? Well, you end up talking to the cemetery oversight, and they help coordinate and talk people through what the options of what to do are and what might have been the issues and the problems. And you never knew what you were going to be dealing with when you went to one of the monthly meetings, because it could be about something sad like that. It could be about a monument dealer who was taking people's money and never giving them the monuments. It could be about a developer wanting to build buildings in an area where there's a suspected historic unmarked graveyard. It could be about restoration processes in older cemeteries in the state. It's just, I guess I sound very funeral nerdy, but boy, that was really interesting and fun.
No, I mean, there are things that I just don't think a regular layperson like myself would even think about. You know, I see some of that stuff in the newspaper. I think that one of the flooded old burial grounds was just on the news the other day. I think an African American cemetery, they're having problems in Montgomery County around a lot of that. And I never thought, like, okay, who oversees that? You know, who deals with that? So it's kind of nice to know that there's somebody that handles it.
It does. It's a very comforting idea that somebody knows what they're doing. Yes. You just have to know how to find the somebody.
Very true. Yeah. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to add. Yeah.
Well, when I was on the OCO, right before I first was appointed to it, there was a wonderful lady who was one of the consumer members of the board there, and she worked for the Maryland, the Funeral Coalition. That
Funeral Consumer Alliance.
That's it. She worked for them, and she was such an amazing woman. She was so well spoken. She was so direct, and it was an honor to get to hear her take on everything at the OCO meetings. She passed away right before I was on the appointments, but I'm telling you, the people that work at the Consumers Alliance are really passionate and informative, and I was just happy to know that they exist, which not everybody does.
Yeah, I found them because of you, and I sat on their board briefly for about 2 months until they were rewriting their bylaws, and they realized because of what I do now that I wasn't allowed to be on their board. But it was really interesting to hear what they are about, and going up, I live here in Annapolis, obviously, and going up to the legislator to legislate for different things and what they have to deal with. I guess being fought over certain things. I never was lucky enough to get into a lot of the nitty gritty because I wasn't there long enough, but I'm definitely a member. So yeah. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to add. Like I said, this is called Funeral Disruptors because I see a need for something different, in the industry.
I think that it would be wonderful to bring people's attention to the choices and options more than they normally are looking at. I know that a lot of states have been welcoming and a lot of states have been unwelcoming to the idea of green cemeteries. And green cemeteries could be the next great thing if your state's going to let them in. If the people who want to open the cemeteries are going to follow the rules of each state that they're going to go into. That's one fantastic thing to look at. And then also the idea of this alternate cremation method that is available. It is now licensed in the U.S., but each state has to determine whether or not they will allow, they refer to it as alternative cremation, but it's a hydrolysis version. And I don't know enough about it to say whether or not I think everybody should get one, but I do know that there's plenty more options than people are taking advantage of in this world.
Yeah. I think that's the Aquamation that you're referring to. I think that's, well, at least that's the brand name.
Right. There's several different brands. I don't know how many different brands, but I know that there's another name for it that I'm thinking of, and that's alkaline hydrolysis, I think, is the process. Yeah. But
yeah, and then there's 2 states now that have the open air funeral pyres, or at least one, and I think Maine is working to get one.
Oh, okay. Well, that's actually something I was thinking about this morning. I was thinking that Colorado is, I don't know if they are still the Wild Wild West, but they had always been discussed as the Wild Wild West because they have no board of funeral directors and morticians. So they don't have licensure requirements in their state for funeral homes. So Felicia, you could just go there and open up a funeral home and make your appointment to go to that open air funeral pyre and have that open air cremation. And it's scary. It's a scary bedtime story to tell intern apprentice funeral directors. Colorado, where there are no rules. But then you think, well, you know what? Maybe I'm a family from India and I am accustomed to an open air cremation, and I really, really want Grandpa to have what he would have back home in India. And so you are in Colorado around that one place that does it. So yeah, there's always a way to do something.
Yes. Yep. And that's what I found refreshing as I, like last year, studied so much of this and wrote the workbooks about it. There is so much out there that is not discussed on a regular level, and that's why I'm doing this. So I want to thank you very much for joining us today. I could probably talk to you forever about this stuff because it's fascinating to me. And
well, good luck so much, because I really want everybody to be disrupted.
I think that's just part of our nature. It's in the last name. Thank you. And I am inspired to share this information, and I thank you for joining us. You can find my 2 end-of-life, first of their kind planning workbooks on Amazon under my name, Felicia Barlow Clark. You can also download a free extensive executor checklist from my website, which covers details from what to do immediately following a death to military service details and handling taxes. My website is celebratingthedash.com. I believe the privilege of a lifetime is being who we are, and every life should be celebrated for the years lived between birth and death.